Alexandra Feodorovna, the last empress of Russia, is remembered today mainly through two images. The first is religious. In the year 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized her husband Nicholas II, and their 5 children as passion bearers, recognizing what church authorities described as the humility and faith the family showed in the hours before their deaths. The second image is closer to a fairy tale. For most of the 20th century, a large public believed that at least one of Alexandra's daughters had escaped the killing in Yekaterinburg and lived on under another name. A woman known as Anna Anderson spent 60 years insisting she was Grand Duchess Anastasia, and her story was adapted into books and films seen by millions. Both images agree on one point, that something of the family got out intact, either through faith or through flight. The documented record, built from letters, diaries, telegrams, and eventually DNA testing, describes something different. It describes a mother whose decisions determined how each of her 5 children lived, and it confirms that none of them got out at all. This is the story of Alexandra Feodorovna and the 5 children she raised and lost together. Alix of Hesse was born on June 6, 1872, in Darmstadt, in the German state of Hesse. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and spent much of her childhood in England after her mother's early death. She met the future Nicholas II as a teenager and initially turned down his proposal, reluctant to give up her Lutheran faith for Russian Orthodoxy. She changed her mind years later. The couple married on November 26, 1894 in St. Petersburg, weeks after the death of Nicholas's father had placed him on the throne sooner than either of them expected. Alix converted and took the name Alexandra Feodorovna. People close to the family described the marriage as a genuine love match, unusual among royal unions arranged mainly for political advantage. The pressure to produce a male heir began almost immediately. Between 1895 and 1901, Alexandra gave birth to 4 daughters in succession: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Each birth was met with public disappointment rather than celebration, since Russian succession law required a son. By 1903, Alexandra's desperation had grown severe enough that she experienced a false pregnancy, convinced for months that she was carrying a child who did not exist. In August 1904, she finally gave birth to a son, Alexei. The relief lasted only weeks. Doctors soon discovered that the boy suffered from hemophilia, a blood disorder that prevents normal clotting, passed down without Alexandra's knowledge from Queen Victoria's own bloodline. A minor injury could cause internal bleeding that no doctor of the period could reliably stop. Alexandra and Nicholas decided to treat Alexei's condition as a state secret. Only a small circle of relatives, physicians, and later a few carefully chosen tutors and companions knew the truth of the illness that would eventually kill him. To the Russian public, the heir to the throne remained an image on official postcards: a healthy boy in a sailor suit smiling beside his 4 sisters. The gap between that image and the reality inside the palace shaped the rest of Alexandra's life. Around 1905, a Siberian peasant named Grigory Rasputin was introduced to the imperial couple. Rasputin claimed a spiritual gift for easing Alexei's bleeding episodes, and over the following years, he began visiting the palace regularly, mostly because Alexandra believed he alone could keep her son alive. That belief was tested severely in 1912 during a family stay at the hunting estate of Spala, in what is now Poland. After a fall, likely from a boat, the 8-year-old Alexei developed a severe internal hemorrhage in his leg and groin. The bleeding did not stop for days. Doctors told the family there was no hope, and a priest administered last rites. At one point, the boy, convinced he was dying, asked his mother whether the pain would stop once he was dead. Rasputin, who was not present at the estate, sent a telegram: "The illness will not be dangerous. Do not let the doctors make him tired." A second telegram followed, saying he had prayed and that the prayers had been heard. Within days, against every medical expectation, Alexei began to recover. No doctor present could explain the improvement. From that point on, Alexandra never doubted Rasputin again, and Nicholas, previously skeptical, became a believer as well. Alexandra had suffered for years from a collection of physical complaints, including chronic back pain, heart palpitations, and exhaustion, which doctors of her time struggled to diagnose and which she herself often blamed on her nerves. Read today, her decades of poor health and the constant private worry visible throughout her letters resemble what would now likely be described as chronic anxiety, worsened by a secret she could share with almost no one. In 1912, no such explanation existed. What her contemporaries saw was a withdrawn, sickly empress who rarely appeared in public and who depended entirely on a wandering mystic with no medical training to keep her son alive. While Alexei's illness occupied most of his parents' attention, the four daughters grew up under a regime their mother considered morally necessary, despite the family's wealth. The girls slept on simple camp beds without pillows, took cold baths each morning, and wore clothing that was mended and passed down rather than replaced. They rarely met children outside their own family and were educated almost entirely at home. In official photographs, they appeared as a nearly interchangeable group, dressed alike in white, smiling in matching poses. Their public wardrobe was the one exception to the plainness. For appearances and portraits, Alexandra dressed all four in identical, costly outfits, even while their daily routine at home stayed deliberately austere. They referred to themselves collectively using an acronym built from their first initials, OTMA, and their mother grouped them further into the big pair, Olga and Tatiana, and the little pair, Maria and Anastasia. Privately, the four were distinct people. Olga was introspective and literary, prone to low moods, and increasingly aware that she had little control over her own future. Tatiana was organized and reserved, so capable at managing practical matters that her sisters nicknamed her the governess. She was also the daughter Alexandra relied on most and felt closest to in temperament. Maria was physically strong, warm, and openly affectionate, wanting nothing more complicated than marriage and children of her own. Yet she remains, in most historical accounts, the least clearly remembered of the four. Anastasia was sharp-witted and mischievous, and, by her mother's own account, the only one of her children who could reliably make her laugh. The isolation imposed on the four girls, later described by biographers as unusually strict for children of their rank, would today likely be discussed using the language of overprotective parenting. A controlled environment, almost no contact with peers, and restricted reading material, all justified at the time as protection rather than recognized as confinement. Olga's own romantic life shows the same pattern. As a teenager, she grew fond of a young naval officer, Pavel Voronov, who served aboard the family's yacht, but her parents would not permit the relationship to continue because of his low military rank. The one clear exception to that pattern came in 1914, when Olga, the eldest, was proposed as a bride for Crown Prince Carol of Romania. Russian and Romanian diplomats both favored the match. Nicholas and Alexandra, who had married for love themselves, insisted the final decision belonged to their daughter. Olga met Carol twice, disliked him, and refused the marriage, telling her father she did not want to leave Russia or give up her nationality. The engagement was quietly dropped. By most accounts, it was the only major decision about her own future that Olga was ever allowed to make freely. It also meant that when war arrived weeks later, and revolution not long after that, she remained inside the country rather than outside it. World War I broke out that August. Alexandra, Olga, and Tatiana trained as Red Cross nurses and worked daily shifts at a military hospital set up on the grounds of their own residence, dressing wounds and assisting in operations alongside ordinary Russian women. Maria and Anastasia, considered too young for nursing duties at 15 and 13, instead visited a smaller convalescent hospital nearby, spending afternoons with wounded soldiers and writing letters home for men who could not write themselves. Tatiana went further, personally organizing and administering a large committee that assisted refugees displaced by the fighting, a level of practical responsibility unusual for a 17-year-old, royal or otherwise. The war also placed Alexandra in a role she was unprepared for. When Nicholas left in September 1915 to take personal command of the army at the front, he left Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs in the capital. Advised largely by Rasputin, she dismissed a series of experienced ministers and replaced them with men Rasputin favored, regardless of their competence. Combined with her German birth, this made her deeply unpopular. Rumors spread without evidence that she was secretly loyal to Germany. She was openly called the German woman in the streets and inside the Duma, Russia's elected assembly. Nicholas's own mother, the Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, tried repeatedly to intervene. A former head of the Russian Red Cross herself, with decades of experience at court, she distrusted Rasputin from the beginning and pressed her son directly to remove him from the family's life and to limit Alexandra's political role. Nicholas, caught between his mother's warnings and his wife's certainty, did nothing. Rasputin was murdered in December 1916 by a group that included one of the Tsar's own relatives, men who had reached the same conclusion as Marie Feodorovna by a different route. His death did not restore the monarchy's standing. It came too late for that. By February 1917, food shortages and strikes in the capital had turned into open revolution. Nicholas abdicated on March 15th. He initially signed the document in favor of Alexei, then changed the decision within hours, after doctors warned him that his son was unlikely to survive long if separated from his parents during whatever exile followed. Nicholas abdicated a second time, for himself and for Alexei together, ending both of their claims to the throne in the same afternoon. The family was placed under house arrest at the Alexander Palace and, in August 1917, moved further from the capital to Tobolsk in western Siberia, where they were housed in the former governor's residence, a building the guards nicknamed, without apparent irony, Freedom House. In April 1918, Bolshevik authorities in Moscow ordered the family transferred west, intending a public trial for Nicholas. Alexei was in the middle of a severe hemorrhage at the time and could not be moved. Alexandra had to choose between accompanying her husband, whose situation seemed the most dangerous, and remaining with her son, whose health made travel dangerous in a different way. She chose to go with Nicholas, taking only Maria with her, and leaving Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia behind in Tobolsk to look after their brother. Along the way, the group carrying Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria was intercepted by soldiers loyal to the Ural Regional Soviet, who redirected them to the city of Yekaterinburg instead of Moscow. There, the family was confined to a requisitioned merchant's house that had belonged to an engineer named Ipatiev. The guards called it the House of Special Purpose. Once Alexei was well enough to travel, his three sisters rejoined the family in late May. 11 people, 7 family members and 4 servants, physician Eugene Botkin, maid Anna Demidova, cook Ivan Karitonov, and footman Alexei Trupp were confined to 5 rooms. Windows were painted over, and the only source of fresh air was a single small window in the daughter's bedroom, which they were forbidden even to look through. Guards searched the family's belongings repeatedly and controlled even their movement to the bathroom. According to accounts given later by some of the guards and disputed by other historians, Maria grew close to one of them, a young man named Ivan Skorokodov, who smuggled her a cake for her 19th birthday in June. The two were discovered together not long afterward. Skorokodov was removed from duty and nothing more came of it. On July 16th, Alexandra wrote her final diary entry. It described an ordinary day, A short walk outside, a note that Alexei had a slight cold, Bible readings with Tatiana in the afternoon, a card game with Nicholas after supper. Nothing in it suggests she expected what came next. Past midnight, the commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, woke the family and told them they needed to move to the basement, citing unrest in the streets outside. They dressed and were led downstairs, told they would wait there briefly, supposedly to be photographed before being moved again. Chairs were brought in for Alexandra and Alexei, since neither could stand for long. Once the family and their 4 servants were assembled, Yurovsky read a short statement informing Nicholas that he had been sentenced to death. Gunfire began immediately. Nicholas and Alexandra were killed within the first moments. The 4 daughters, whose corsets and undergarments had been sewn with the family's remaining jewels for safekeeping during the imprisonment, survived the initial volley. The gems caused bullets to ricochet inside the small room. Guards finished the killings with bayonets. The process took close to 20 minutes. All 11 people in the room died: the former Tsar and Tsarina, their 5 children, and their 4 servants. The Bolshevik government initially announced only Nicholas's death, claiming the rest of the family had been moved to a secure location. The bodies were driven into the countryside, doused in acid, and hidden in 2 separate pits to prevent identification. For decades, the fate of the children remained officially unconfirmed inside Russia, and rumors of survival spread abroad. In February 1920, a young woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin after an apparent suicide attempt. 2 years later, in a mental hospital, she told a nurse she was Anastasia. She became known as Anna Anderson and spent the rest of her life, until her death in 1984, insisting she was the youngest Romanov daughter. Her claim divided historians and held public attention for 6 decades, producing books and films that reached far more people than the real Anastasia's 17 years ever had. The larger grave near Yekaterinburg was located in 1991, containing 9 sets of remains: the parents, 3 of the daughters, and the 4 servants. 2 children were still missing, a gap that kept survival theories alive even after the discovery. In 1994, DNA drawn from a preserved surgical sample of Anna Anderson's tissue was compared against a sample from Prince Philip, a maternal relative of the Romanovs. It did not match. Later testing identified Anderson as Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker. In the summer of 2007, a second, smaller grave was found roughly 70 meters from the first, containing 2 more sets of remains. DNA testing completed by 2008 identified them as Alexei and Maria. Anastasia, it turned out, had been among the 9 bodies recovered in 1991 all along, simply not yet distinguished by name from her sisters. Every member of the family had died in the basement that night. No one had gotten out. Olga died at 22, having spent her adult years in wartime hospital wards and under house arrest, granted once the freedom to refuse a marriage, a decision that kept her inside Russia when the war and the revolution arrived. Tatiana died at 21, having run committees and households from her teens onward because her mother needed her to. Maria died at 19, remembered by her own family as warm and by history as the least defined of the 4 sisters. She went to her death with fewer jewels sewn into her clothing than her sisters, a detail some historians read as a lingering sign of distrust after her closeness with a guard was discovered. Anastasia died at 17, and then, through a stranger's claim, became more famous after her death than she had ever been while alive. Alexei died at 13, having spent nearly all of his short life as the reason behind almost every decision his parents made, without ever having a say in any of them. Alexandra Feodorovna's canonization describes a woman who met death with faith and composure. It says nothing about the decisions that placed her and her children in that basement. The choice to conceal Alexei's illness completely rather than manage it openly. The choice to hand her son's care to an unqualified outsider instead of the court's own physicians. The choice to isolate her daughters from ordinary life. And the choice to take direct political control of a country she never fully understood, replacing ministers on a mystic's advice instead of her own, were all made years before July 1918, mostly by her. Her children did not choose any of it. They lived inside the consequences of it, each in a different way, and in the end, they died inside the same consequence, together, in one room, in under 20 minutes. The Passion Bearer icon shows a family that accepted its fate peacefully. The Anastasia legend shows a girl who found a way out. The forensic record shows neither. It shows 5 children whose lives were shaped almost entirely by their mother's choices and whose deaths, when they finally came, were identical to hers.